The Nile has gone the color of honey tonight. And somewhere beyond the temple columns, an oil lamp is still burning. If a slow night like this is what you needed, a quiet like helps this find its way to someone else who needs it too. And if you're settling in, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's nice to know who's out there in the dark with me. Before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let everything else wait until morning. Ancient Egypt did not think of itself as ancient at all. For the people who lived along the Nile some 3,000 years ago, their civilization already felt impossibly old, layered with monuments built by ancestors so distant that even the pharaohs of the New Kingdom visited pyramids as tourists might today, curious about a past they could barely reconstruct. The golden age most people picture when they imagine Egypt, the great temples, the gilded tombs, the powerful god-kings, actually refers to a fairly specific stretch of time, roughly the 16th to the 11th century BCE, known to historians as the New Kingdom. Egypt had already existed for well over 1,000 years by that point. This was the era of Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Ramesses the Great, when Egypt controlled territory stretching from Nubia in the south to parts of the Levant in the north, and when the wealth flowing into the capital cities was almost impossible to overstate. What made this period different from earlier centuries was not simply prosperity, but the sheer scale of ambition it allowed. Temples were no longer just religious buildings. They became small cities in themselves, employing thousands of priests, craftsmen, farmers, and administrators. The Temple of Karnak alone, dedicated to the god Amun, grew over centuries into one of the largest religious complexes ever built anywhere in the world, its columned halls rising more than 20 meters high, painted in colors that have long since faded but were once brilliant reds, blues, and golds meant to overwhelm anyone who walked beneath them. Society during this period was structured with remarkable precision, though not in the rigid, unchanging way it's sometimes portrayed. At the top sat the pharaoh, considered a living link between the human and divine worlds. But beneath that single figure existed an enormous and surprisingly mobile bureaucracy. Scribes, in particular, held a position of real social power. Literacy was rare enough that knowing how to read and write hieroglyphic and hieratic script could lift a family from modest means into genuine influence within a generation. One detail that tends to surprise people is just how bureaucratic daily governance actually was. Egyptian administrators kept meticulous records of grain harvests, tax obligations, water levels of the Nile, and labor assignments, all written on papyrus that has, in some remarkably dry regions, survived for thousands of years. Some of these documents read almost like modern office memos. Complaints about missed deliveries, requests for sick leave, arguments over unpaid wages. It softens the image of Egypt as a place of only monuments and myth, revealing instead a functioning, occasionally frustrating, deeply human system of administration. The pharaoh's court itself, meanwhile, was less a single palace than a shifting network of residences. Since rulers often moved between cities depending on the season and on religious obligations tied to specific temples, Thebes, in the south, served as a major religious center, while cities further north handled more of the practical business of governing a kingdom that bordered rival powers like the Hittites and the Mitanni. Diplomacy, in fact, was conducted with striking sophistication. Surviving letters between Egyptian pharaohs and foreign kings, written in Akkadian cuneiform rather than Egyptian script, reveal a world of marriage alliances, exchanged gifts, and careful, calculated flattery between rulers who each considered themselves the center of the civilized world. It is this layered, carefully maintained system, part myth, part bureaucracy, part diplomacy, that later chapters will explore piece by piece. At the center of this entire system stood a figure who was, by definition, More than a man, the pharaoh was understood by his subjects as a living god, the earthly form of Horus, and upon death, an embodiment of Osiris. This was not mere flattery or political theater. Egyptian religious thought held that the pharaoh's presence maintained Ma'at, the cosmic balance between order and chaos, and that without a functioning king, the Nile might fail to flood, crops might wither, and the boundary between the living world and the underworld might blur. Everything the pharaoh did, from waking rituals to the food placed before him, was wrapped in ceremony meant to reaffirm that balance daily. Because of this divine status, the pharaoh's household operated on a scale that dwarfed even the grandest bureaucratic offices. Some kings maintained multiple queens simultaneously, along with dozens of secondary wives and children, housed in a section of the court, sometimes referred to, in modern scholarship, as the royal harem, though the term carries different connotations than the Egyptian reality. These were less about seclusion and more about political architecture. Marriages were frequently arranged with foreign rulers to secure alliances, and daughters of Mitanni or Babylonian kings might arrive in Egypt with entire retinues of attendants, never to return home again. Succession, despite the pharaoh's godly status, was often anything but straightforward. Court intrigue shaped which son, or occasionally which wife, acting as regent, would inherit the throne. Hatshepsut, who ruled as a woman with full pharaonic authority rather than as a queen consort, had herself depicted in official art with the traditional false beard of kingship, not out of vanity, but because Egyptian visual language had no accepted way to represent a female ruler holding full pharaonic power. Later, attempts were made to erase her monuments and inscriptions, though scholars still debate whether this was personal animosity from her successor or a more routine effort to smooth over an irregular succession in the official record. Beneath the pharaoh, an inner circle of advisors, generals, and high priests jostled for influence in ways that rarely appear in the grand temple inscriptions. The vizier acted as something close to a prime minister, overseeing justice, taxation, and construction projects, and reporting directly to the king each morning. Yet the high priesthood of Amun at Thebes grew so wealthy through land grants and temple offerings that by the later New Kingdom, some priests wielded influence rivaling the throne itself, controlling vast estates, granaries, and even their own workforce independent of royal administration. Daily court life revolved around ritual, far more than governance in the way it might be imagined today. Each morning, priests performed a ceremony of dressing and feeding a statue of the god in the temple's inner sanctum, an act the pharaoh was believed to perform by proxy through his priests. Meals at court followed strict codes about what could be offered to a divine king, and even the pharaoh's clothing, jewelry, and cosmetics were chosen according to symbolic meaning rather than personal preference. The black coal lining his eyes was believed to ward off evil as much as it served any decorative purpose. Beyond the palace walls, the machinery of Egyptian daily life depended on a much larger population, whose names rarely appear in any inscription at all. Most Egyptians were farmers, and their entire yearly rhythm was dictated by the flooding of the Nile, a cycle so central to survival that the Egyptian calendar itself was built around it, dividing the year into the season of inundation, the season of growth, and the season of harvest. When the flood waters receded each year, they left behind a layer of dark silt that made the soil extraordinarily fertile, which is part of why the ancient Egyptians referred to their own land as Kemet, meaning the black land, distinguishing it from the barren red land of the surrounding desert. Farmers grew emmer wheat and barley for bread and beer, along with flax for linen, and vegetables like onions, leeks, and lettuce. Beer, notably, was not a luxury, but a dietary staple consumed by nearly everyone, including children, since it was safer than untreated water and provided crucial daily calories. During the months when the fields lay under water and farming was impossible, many of these same farmers were conscripted into labor service for the state, a system historians often compare loosely to a form of taxation paid in work rather than goods. This seasonal labor force, is now understood to be the actual workforce behind massive construction projects, like the pyramids and temple complexes, not slaves, as popular imagination long assumed, but ordinary Egyptians fulfilling an obligation to the pharaoh during their agricultural off-season. Archaeological excavations at Deir el-Medina, a village built specifically to house the workers who constructed royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, have provided an unusually intimate window into the lives of skilled laborers. These were not unskilled farmers, but trained artisans, painters, and stonecutters, and they were paid in rations of grain, beer, and other goods, rather than currency, since coined money did not yet exist in Egypt. Records from the village even document what may be the earliest known labor strike in recorded history, when workers stopped their tasks after their rations arrived late, sitting down in protest until the grievance was addressed. Egyptian society below the royal court was structured, but it was not entirely rigid. Below the vizier and the priesthood sat scribes, craftsmen, and merchants, and below them the great mass of farmers, with servants and enslaved people occupying the lowest tier, many of them prisoners of war rather than a hereditary underclass. Social mobility, while limited, was not impossible. A talented scribe from a modest family could rise into administrative positions, and skilled artisans at places like Deir el-Medina were treated with a level of respect and stability unusual for laborers of the ancient world. Women in this working world held a surprising degree of legal independence for the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Egyptian women could own property, initiate divorce, and represent themselves in legal disputes without a male guardian speaking on their behalf, rights that would not appear in many other ancient civilizations for centuries, if ever, beyond the palace walls and the workshops of ordinary craftsmen. Ancient Egypt maintained an enormous population that made the entire civilization possible in ways rarely discussed, its servants and enslaved laborers, whose lives looked quite different depending on when in Egyptian history they lived. Slavery in Egypt was not the same institution as the plantation slavery many people picture today. Most people bound to labor were prisoners of war, brought back by the thousands after military campaigns in Nubia or the Levant, or people who had sold themselves or their children into servitude during times of famine or debt. Their status was not always permanent or hereditary in the way slavery would later become in other parts of the world. Some served in temple households, others in the homes of officials, and a number eventually earned their freedom, married into the families that held them, or purchased their own release with wages earned on the side. Legal documents even record enslaved individuals appearing in court and testifying, something almost unthinkable under later slave systems elsewhere. Within wealthy households, domestic servants performed the unglamorous labor that kept elite daily life running, grinding grain for bread, brewing the beer consumed at every meal, hauling water, nursing children, and managing kitchens that might feed dozens of family members and guests. Wet nurses held a surprisingly respected position, sometimes remaining attached to a household for life and receiving warm mentions in tomb inscriptions decades later, remembered fondly by the children they had raised. Temple institutions like Karnak relied on enormous numbers of dependent laborers to farm the vast tracts of land donated to the god Amun over centuries. These temple lands eventually made institutions like Karnak into some of the largest employers and landholders in the entire ancient world, with workers who tended fields, herded temple cattle, and processed offerings brought in from across Egypt. Their labor, largely undocumented by name, quietly sustained the religious economy that gave Egyptian civilization its recognizable art and architecture. Medicine offers another underappreciated window into daily Egyptian life. Physicians trained through formal apprenticeship and left behind papyri, like the Edwin Smith and Ebers papyri, describing remarkably systematic diagnoses for injuries, tumors, and infections, alongside remedies that mixed genuine empirical observation with magical incantation. Some surgical techniques described for treating wounds and setting bones were sound enough that modern doctors reading the translated texts have expressed real admiration. Dentistry was less successful. Skeletal remains show that worn teeth, abscesses, and dental pain were nearly universal, a consequence of bread that was gritty with sand and ground stone from the milling process. Even pest control and household pragmatism come through in the record. Egyptians used cats not merely as sacred animals, but as working pest control against the mice and snakes that threaten granaries, and mousetraps alongside cat skeletons have both turned up in archaeological digs near storage facilities. It is a small detail, but it captures something true about Egyptian life. At every level of society, the sacred and the practical rarely stayed separate for long, woven together in ways that modern categories struggle to fully untangle. Beyond the granaries and the workshops, food itself shaped nearly every hour of an ordinary Egyptian's day, and the diet was far more varied than the image of plain bread and beer might suggest. Bread came in dozens of forms, flavored with dates, honey, or herbs, and shaped into cones, rounds, or flat discs baked in clay ovens that dotted the courtyards of even modest homes. Onions, garlic, leeks, and lettuce grew abundantly along the Nile's banks, and lettuce in particular held a curious symbolic association with fertility and the god Min, appearing in temple offerings as well as ordinary meals. Fish pulled from the Nile supplemented the diet of most households, though priests were often forbidden from eating certain species considered sacred or ritually impure. Meat, by contrast, remained a luxury. Cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered mainly for feasts, festivals, or offerings, meaning the average farmer or laborer likely tasted meat only a handful of times a year. Wealthier households enjoyed a far richer table, with roasted duck, goose, and imported wine, supplementing the beer that everyone, rich or poor, continued to drink daily. Honey served as the primary sweetener long before sugar existed in the region, and beekeeping was practiced with enough sophistication that Egyptians are among the earliest known cultures to manage hives deliberately rather than simply gathering wild honeycomb. Beekeepers would float hives down the Nile on rafts, allowing bees to pollinate flowering crops in different regions as the seasons changed. A form of migratory beekeeping that some historians consider remarkably advanced for its time. Clothing, like food, reflected both climate and class. Linen, woven from flax grown along the riverbanks, was the fabric of choice for nearly everyone, prized for how well it breathed in the Egyptian heat. The finest linen, worn by nobility and priests, was woven so thin it was nearly transparent, and multiple layers were sometimes worn together to achieve modesty and status simultaneously. Ordinary laborers, meanwhile, often wore simple kilts or worked bare-chested in the fields. Since practicality mattered more than appearance under the sun, cosmetics crossed gender lines in a way that might surprise modern observers. Both men and women lined their eyes heavily with kohl, a substance made from ground galena or other minerals, and this was not purely decorative. The kohl likely offered some protection against the sun's glare and against eye infections common in a land where wind-blown sand carried bacteria into open wounds and irritated eyes constantly. Jewelry, too, was worn broadly across class lines, though the materials differed sharply. The wealthy adorned themselves with gold, carnelian, and lapis lazuli, imported from as far as Afghanistan, while poorer Egyptians wore beads made of faience, a glazed ceramic that imitated the appearance of precious stone at a fraction of the cost. Scent held real cultural importance as well. Perfumed oils and unguents were applied not just for pleasant fragrance, but as protection for the skin against the dry desert air, and cones of scented fat were sometimes worn atop wigs at banquets, slowly melting through the evening to release fragrance, according to artistic depictions that have prompted debate among modern historians about how literally to interpret them. Homes in ancient Egypt tell their own quiet story, one written not in stone temples, but in mud brick, which was cheap, practical, and remarkably well suited to the climate. Most houses, whether in a farming village or a bustling city like Thebes, were built from bricks made of Nile mud mixed with straw and left to dry in the sun. Walls were kept thick to hold back the heat of the day, and windows were small and set high, letting air circulate while keeping interiors shaded and cool. Roofs were flat, and for good reason. Families used them constantly, sleeping there on hot nights, drying grain and herbs, or simply escaping the closeness of small rooms below. A typical home for a working family was modest, often just a few rooms arranged in a line, an entry space, a main living area, and sleeping quarters toward the back. Cooking usually happened outdoors or in a small open courtyard, since ovens produced smoke and heat better kept away from living spaces. Furniture was minimal by modern standards. Most households owned low stools, simple wooden chests for storage, and mats or low platforms for sleeping, since actual beds with legs were something of a luxury. Wealthier homes, by contrast, could sprawl into multi-room compounds with gardens, pools for fish or lotus flowers, and separate quarters for servants. Color and decoration were not reserved only for temples and tombs. Interior walls of homes, especially among the more prosperous, were sometimes whitewashed and painted with simple geometric patterns, or scenes drawn from nature, birds, papyrus reeds, the kind of imagery that echoed the Nile itself. Floors were often just packed earth, though finer homes might use woven reed matting. Villages themselves were tightly clustered, houses built close together along narrow lanes, which helped conserve precious agricultural land along the riverbanks for farming rather than housing. Deir el-Medina, the same artisan village known for its records of tomb builders, also gives historians an unusually complete picture of ordinary domestic life, since its houses have survived in far better condition than most. Excavations there reveal not just room layouts, but household shrines, cooking equipment, and even children's toys, offering a rare, intimate glimpse into how a working Egyptian family actually lived day to day. Sanitation was basic, but not entirely absent. Some homes, particularly those of officials or the wealthy, had simple bathrooms with a stone slab and drainage channels leading waste away from the house, along with rudimentary toilets consisting of a seat over a removable container. Water itself had to be carried in from wells or canals, usually a daily task performed by women or servants, since indoor plumbing as a shared household norm did not exist. Heat, dust, and insects shaped daily domestic habits in ways easy to overlook. Doorways were often hung with reed mats rather than solid doors, allowing airflow while offering some privacy. Small offerings and household deities, particularly figures like Bes, protector of the home and of childbirth, were kept in modest niches, blending the sacred into the most ordinary corners of everyday life. A reminder that religion in Egypt was never confined only to the grand temples along the Nile. Beyond the walls of the home, daily life in ancient Egypt followed rhythms shaped as much by leisure and craft as by labor. Board games were remarkably widespread, and one in particular, called Senet, appears in tomb paintings, household inventories, and even burial goods, stretching back over 1,000 years. Senet was played on a grid of 30 squares, using carved pieces moved according to throws of sticks or bones acting as dice. It began as pure entertainment, but by the New Kingdom it had taken on a religious dimension, understood as a symbolic journey of the soul through the afterlife, with certain squares representing danger or divine favor. Pharaohs were buried with Senet boards, and ordinary families owned simpler versions carved from wood or scratched directly into stone flooring when no board was available. Music and dance filled both temple ceremony and private celebration, though the two were rarely as separate as they might seem today. Temple musicians, often women attached to a god's household, played harps, lyres, lutes, and sistra, a kind of ceremonial rattle, particularly associated with the worship of the goddess Hathor. At private feasts, hired dancers and musicians performed for guests, and tomb paintings frequently show acrobatic dancers bending backward in ways that suggest genuine athletic training rather than casual movement. Storytelling thrived as well, carried mostly through oral tradition, but occasionally preserved on papyrus. Tales of shipwrecked sailors, clever peasants outwitting corrupt officials, and magical priests performing wonders for bored pharaohs circulated widely enough that fragments survive in multiple copies, suggesting they were popular enough to be copied repeatedly by scribes in training. Children, too, had their own world of play, largely invisible in monumental art, but visible in the archaeological record. Wooden paddle dolls, spinning tops, clay animals with movable jaws, and balls stuffed with reeds or stuffed with dried grass have all been recovered from Egyptian sites. Some toys were clearly homemade, others crafted with enough care to suggest a small domestic industry catering specifically to children. Sport carried a more formal, sometimes political weight. Wrestling and stick fencing appear in detailed sequences on tomb walls, particularly from Middle Kingdom sites, showing paired figures locked in specific holds with almost instructional precision, as though the paintings were meant to record technique rather than simply depict a pastime. Pharaohs were sometimes shown personally demonstrating athletic prowess, hunting lions, driving chariots, or drawing powerful bows as a way of visually reinforcing their fitness to rule. Since physical vigor was tied symbolically to the king's capacity to maintain order, swimming and boating on the Nile were practical skills as much as recreational ones, given how central the river was to transportation. But Egyptian art also shows recreational boating parties, complete with music and refreshments, drifting along the water during festivals. Taken together, these fragments of games, music, stories, and sport suggest a society that valued play not as an afterthought to survival, but as something woven naturally into both the sacred calendar and the quiet hours of ordinary households. Beyond the games and music of daily leisure, the Egyptian calendar was punctuated by public festivals so large they reshaped the rhythm of ordinary life for weeks at a time. The Opet festival at Thebes was among the grandest of these events, drawing crowds who watched as the sacred bark of Amun was carried in procession from Karnak to the Luxor temple. Priests bore the shrine on their shoulders along a route lined with onlookers, and the pharaoh himself often took part, using the occasion to renew his divine authority in full public view. What made these festivals remarkable was not only their religious weight, but their scale as social events. Ordinary Egyptians, who rarely entered temple grounds, were given bread, beer, and meat distributed from temple stores, turning a sacred ceremony into something closer to a citywide holiday. The beautiful festival of the valley offered a different kind of gathering, one centered on remembering the dead. Families crossed the Nile to visit the tombs of relatives on the West Bank, spending the night among the graves with food and drink, singing and speaking to the deceased as though they were still present at the gathering. It reflected a broader Egyptian instinct that death was not a severing of relationship, but a continuation of it, requiring the same hospitality shown to any living guest. Market days brought their own kind of festivity, though far less formal than temple processions. Egypt had no standardized coined currency for most of its history, so exchange happened through barter, with goods like grain, oil, and cloth valued against a mental unit called the debin, used only for bookkeeping rather than as physical money. A basket weaver might trade directly with a sandal maker, haggling over relative worth in a system that required both parties to agree on value each time. It made trade slower, more personal, and dependent on communities where reputations mattered as much as goods. Funerary feasts held for the wealthy blurred the line between mourning and celebration in ways that might surprise modern observers. Tomb inscriptions describe banquets held in honor of the dead, where guests were entertained with music and dancing, the same performances enjoyed at any private feast, but staged explicitly to please a spirit believed to still take pleasure in earthly delights. Some tombs even included painted scenes of these banquets, so that the celebration itself would continue eternally, repeated endlessly in stone and pigment long after the last living guest had gone home. Smaller local festivals honored regional deities throughout the year, often tied to agricultural moments like the return of the Nile's floodwaters or the start of harvest. These were community affairs rather than state spectacles, involving modest processions, offerings left at local shrines, and gatherings that gave ordinary villagers who had little contact with the grand temples of Thebes or Memphis their own version of sacred celebration, scaled to the rhythms of their particular corner of the Black Land. Beyond festivals and feasts, education in ancient Egypt reveals another layer of daily life, one that shaped who could rise within this highly structured society. Formal schooling, where it existed, was almost entirely reserved for boys destined to become scribes, priests, or officials. And it began remarkably young, often around the age of 5. These schools, known as houses of instruction, were frequently attached to temples, where young students copied religious texts, moral sayings, and administrative formulas onto broken pottery shards called ostraca. Since papyrus was too costly to waste on practice work, the curriculum was demanding and, by surviving accounts, often harsh. Teachers were known to use physical discipline freely, and one recovered text advises that a boy's ear is on his back, meaning he listens best when beaten. Students memorized long passages by rote repetition, copying model letters and wisdom texts attributed to famous sages, texts that praised the scribal profession above all other work. One well-known instructional papyrus lists the miseries of manual trades in vivid detail: the blacksmith who smells worse than fish roe, the launderer who washes clothes beside crocodiles, all designed to convince a reluctant student that sitting at a desk with a reed pen was the only sensible path in life. Girls, by contrast, were rarely given formal schooling of this kind, though evidence suggests some daughters of wealthy or elite households learned to read and write informally at home. Since literate women do appear occasionally in the historical record as managing estate accounts or overseeing household affairs, most girls instead learned domestic skills directly from their mothers, including weaving, food preparation, and the management of a household economy. Skills considered essential regardless of social class. For boys who completed scribal training, the reward was significant social mobility. A skilled scribe from a modest family could rise to serve in temple administration, royal building projects, or the treasury, entering a profession exempt from manual labor and taxation demands placed on farmers. Advanced students might specialize further, training in mathematics for surveying and construction, in medicine under temple physicians, or in the complex religious knowledge needed for priestly service. Egyptian mathematics itself was practical rather than abstract, developed to solve real problems, calculating grain storage, land area after the Nile's floods reshaped field boundaries, and the precise angles needed for monumental architecture. Most Egyptian children, of course, never sat in a classroom at all. The vast majority learned trades through apprenticeship, working alongside parents in fields, workshops, or households from a young age, absorbing skills through observation and repetition rather than formal instruction. Literacy remained the exception rather than the rule throughout Egyptian history, which is precisely why the scribes who mastered it held such disproportionate influence over a civilization that otherwise ran on spoken word, memory, and inherited craft. Beyond the schoolroom and the scribal palette, ancient Egypt maintained an entirely different kind of expertise, the specialized knowledge of craftsmen whose skills were passed down through families for generations. Goldsmiths, jewelers, and metalworkers formed some of the most respected artisan classes in Egyptian society. Their techniques so refined that modern goldsmiths still study surviving pieces to understand methods that were never written down, only demonstrated, hand over hand, from master to apprentice. The process of working gold began long before any hammer touched metal. Egypt controlled rich gold deposits in the eastern desert and Nubia, and expeditions sent to retrieve it were treated as state affairs, recorded and guarded, since gold was considered the flesh of the gods, imperishable and radiant like the sun. Once refined, it could be beaten into sheets thinner than a human hair, a technique requiring such patience that a single ornament might occupy a workshop for weeks. Inlay work added another layer of skill entirely. Craftsmen fit slivers of carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli into gold settings with a precision that left almost no visible gap, producing the layered, colorful jewelry now associated with royal burials. Carpentry presented its own quiet challenges. Since Egypt had very little native timber suited to fine furniture, most usable wood, cedar especially, had to be imported from the Levant, making it a valuable commodity reserved largely for royal and elite commissions. Egyptian carpenters compensated for scarcity with technique, joining short or irregular pieces of wood using dovetail joints, pegs, and mortise and tenon construction rather than nails, which were rarely used. Furniture found in royal tombs, including folding stools and inlaid chests, shows joinery sophisticated enough that some pieces remain structurally sound after more than 3,000 years. Pottery making, by contrast, was one of the most widespread and essential trades, practiced in workshops attached to almost every town. Egyptian potters worked with Nile clay on a slow wheel turned by hand or foot, shaping the simple, sturdy vessels used for storing grain, oil, water, and beer in nearly every household. Faience production required more specialized chemistry, involving a crushed quartz paste glazed in brilliant blues and greens through a firing process whose exact temperatures and timing were closely guarded workshop knowledge. Stoneworking sustained Egypt's most visible achievements. From towering temple columns to delicate amulets, sculptors used copper and later bronze tools, along with abrasive sand, to cut and polish granite, limestone, and alabaster, often relying on the same grid-based proportional systems scribes learned for organizing figures on tomb walls. Apprentices in these trades typically began as children accompanying a parent to the workshop, absorbing skills for years before being trusted with fine detail work, a system of inherited craft that shaped entire villages of specialists, whose family names, in some cases, appear in workshop records across multiple generations. Beyond the workshops of goldsmiths and carpenters, ancient Egypt relied on another entire class of craftsmen, whose work rarely survives in museums because it was made to be used until it fell apart. Basket weavers and rope makers turned reeds, papyrus stalks, and palm fiber into the cordage that held Egyptian society together in a very literal sense. Ropes hauled stone blocks up ramps, rigged ships along the Nile, and bound cargo in every market stall. Basketry was so common that archaeologists find woven containers in nearly every household excavation, used for carrying grain, storing linen, or lining the walls of granaries against pests. Textile production beyond simple linen weaving also occupied enormous numbers of workers, many of them women, working in workshops attached to temples or great estates. Spinning thread from flax fibers was slow, repetitive labor, often performed by teams sitting together, and surviving tomb models show entire miniature scenes of women at spinning wheels and looms, suggesting how central this labor was considered even in the afterlife's imagined economy of provisioning the dead. Leather working formed its own specialized trade, turning cattle, goat, and gazelle hides into sandals, bags, and the leather trim used on chariots and military equipment. Tanning was physically unpleasant work, involving soaking hides in solutions that included animal brains and, in some methods, fermented plant matter, and tanneries were kept apart from residential areas because of the smell. Despite the unpleasantness of the trade itself, leather sandals were valued possessions, and simpler versions made from woven papyrus served as an affordable alternative for those who could not afford hide. Brewing and baking, though practiced in homes, also existed as organized professional trades tied to temple and state food production. Since beer and bread functioned partly as currency in a barter economy without coinage, large-scale bakeries and breweries have been excavated near temple complexes, complete with pottery vats and grinding stones, sized for feeding hundreds of workers at once, revealing that, behind the daily staple diet, already described lay an industrial-scale operation rather than simple household cooking. Glass-making developed later than pottery and faience, but became a genuine luxury craft by the New Kingdom, producing small colored vessels for perfumes and cosmetics, through a technique of winding molten glass around a core of clay and dung, which was later scraped out once the glass cooled. The vivid blues and yellows achieved through mineral additives made these vessels prized trade goods, and Egyptian glass has been found as far away as Mycenaean Greece, suggesting these small, delicate objects traveled well beyond the Nile through the same trade networks that carried cedar and lapis lazuli inward. Metalworking beyond gold also supported the practical economy. Coppersmiths and, later, bronze workers produced the tools that other craftsmen depended on entirely. From the chisels of the stone sculptors to the needles used by weavers, these smiths worked with foot-powered bellows to reach the high temperatures needed for casting, a slow and physically demanding craft that quietly enabled nearly every other trade discussed so far, without ever receiving the same reverence as those who shaped gold into the flesh of the gods. Beyond the workshops and temple storerooms, Egypt's economy depended on a network of transport and trade that stretched far beyond the Nile Valley itself. The river was the country's great highway, and boats of every size moved constantly along its current, carrying grain, stone, timber, and people between towns that might otherwise have taken weeks to reach by land. Sailing south against the current was made possible by consistent winds blowing upriver from the Mediterranean, while boats simply drifted north with the flow of the water. This natural rhythm meant Egyptians rarely needed to row long distances, and it shaped how they thought about direction itself. South was described as upriver regardless of altitude, a geography defined entirely by the Nile's behavior rather than the compass. Overland trade relied on donkey caravans, since Egypt had no native heavy draft animals suited to hauling goods across desert routes before horses became more common in the New Kingdom. These caravans connected Egypt to mining regions in the Sinai and the Eastern Desert, bringing back turquoise, copper, and the gold so central to royal artistry. Expeditions sent to these remote sites were often state-organized affairs involving hundreds of workers, soldiers for protection, and scribes to record yields. Since Egypt treated these mineral resources as extensions of royal wealth rather than open commercial ventures, foreign trade extended much further than most people imagine. Egyptian ships sailed to the land of Punt, a distant region likely along the Red Sea coast of modern Eritrea or Somalia, to bring back incense, myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals. Queen Hatshepsut famously commissioned one of the best documented Punt expeditions, and temple reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show the journey in remarkable detail. The foreign rulers, their unusual houses built on stilts and ships loaded with fragrant resin for temple incense. This incense was not a luxury indulgence, but a religious necessity, burned constantly in temple ritual to please the gods. Egypt also maintained trade relationships with Byblos on the Lebanese coast, primarily for cedar wood, and with Crete and the wider Aegean world, exchanging pottery, oils, and finished crafts. Because Egypt had no standard coinage, all of this exchange operated through barter systems anchored to the deben weight of copper or silver, meaning a merchant's honesty and a scale's accuracy mattered enormously in any transaction, foreign or domestic. Market exchange within Egyptian towns was informal but active, typically conducted in open riverside or town squares where farmers, craftsmen, and fishermen laid out goods for direct barter. Someone might trade a portion of dried fish for a woven basket, or linen cloth for a jar of beer, all valued mentally against the deben standard, even without physical coins changing hands. Tomb paintings occasionally depict these scenes with surprising humor, showing haggling gestures and animated disagreement over value, a small glimpse of ordinary commercial life that has otherwise left few written records. since scribes were far more interested in documenting state granaries than a fisherman's afternoon at the market. Beyond the market stalls and caravan routes, Egypt maintained something less visible, but equally essential, a system of law and justice that touched everyone, from the vizier's office down to the smallest village. Egyptian law was never written down as a single formal code, the way it was in Mesopotamia under Hammurabi. Instead, it rested on the concept of ma'at, the same principle of cosmic balance and truth that the pharaoh was believed to uphold simply by existing. Judges were expected to rule according to precedent, common sense, and a sense of what was right, rather than consulting a fixed list of statutes. Local disputes were usually handled by a council of elders known as the kenbet, made up of respected townspeople, priests, or officials who heard testimony and issued rulings in relatively informal settings. Only more serious matters, like major property disputes, tomb robbery, or crimes against the state, escalated toward the vizier, or, in rare cases, the pharaoh himself. Ordinary Egyptians could and did bring cases forward personally, without needing a lawyer to speak for them, and surviving court records show plaintiffs arguing their own grievances over stolen goods, unpaid debts, or boundary disagreements between neighboring fields. Oaths played an unusually central role in Egyptian courtrooms. A person could be asked to swear formally, often invoking the pharaoh's name or a god's name, that their testimony was true, and lying under such an oath was considered a serious spiritual offense, not just a legal one. Punishments varied by severity. Fines and restitution were common for minor theft, while more serious crimes could bring beatings, forced labor, mutilation, or exile to remote mining regions. Execution was reserved mainly for the gravest offenses, such as treason or major temple robbery. Tomb robbery, in particular, became such a persistent problem by the late New Kingdom that entire investigative records survive describing organized trials. One well-documented case from Thebes describes officials interrogating workers suspected of looting royal tombs, with testimonies recorded in detail on papyrus, including confessions extracted under questioning. These documents give a rare, almost procedural glimpse into how seriously the state treated crimes against the dead, since disturbing a tomb was seen as an offense against the deceased's eternal soul, not merely property damage. Women's legal standing, already notable in property and marriage matters covered earlier, extended fully into the courtroom as well. Women could serve as witnesses, initiate lawsuits, and have their testimony weighed equally alongside men's in surviving trial records. A level of legal equality that was unusual compared to many neighboring civilizations of the same era. Even prisons, in the modern sense, were rare. Most punishment was corrective, restorative, or physical, rather than centered on long-term confinement, reflecting a broader Egyptian instinct to restore balance quickly rather than remove wrongdoers from society for extended periods. Beyond the courts and the councils, Egypt maintained something closer to a standing security apparatus. Though it looked very different from a modern police force, local order was largely kept by a group known as the Medjai, a name that originally referred to a Nubian people, but came, over centuries, to describe a professional class of paramilitary guards regardless of their actual ancestry. They patrolled desert edges, guarded royal tombs, and served as something like a rural constabulary, watching roads and settlements for theft or unrest. At Deir el-Medina, Medjai officers are recorded checking on the artisan's village, a reminder that even a community of skilled royal craftsmen needed watching. Tomb security was a particular obsession of the state, and for good reason. The treasures buried with the dead were an open invitation to theft. Guards were stationed near royal necropolises. Boundary markers and inspection tours were used to monitor sealed tombs, and officials conducted periodic checks to confirm that seals remained unbroken. Despite all this, the surviving trial records make clear that robbery still happened, often through bribery of the very officials meant to prevent it. Punishment in Egypt leaned heavily on the physical and the symbolic rather than confinement. which fits with the earlier absence of long-term prisons. Beatings, forced labor, and mutilation appear in texts as consequences for serious crimes, while for the most severe offenses, particularly treason or violations against royal authority, execution was possible, sometimes by impalement or drowning. Methods meant to be public and deterrent rather than hidden away. Confiscation of property and forced labor sentences appear frequently for lesser offenses, since taking someone's ability to work off a debt to the state was often more useful to the administration than removing them from society entirely. One of the more striking cases to survive involves a conspiracy against Ramesses III, in which multiple members of the royal harem plotted the pharaoh's assassination. The trial records, remarkably specific, show conspirators identified by pseudonyms rather than their real names in the court documents, names that translate to things like the one who is condemned, apparently to avoid dignifying the accused with their true identities, even in official record-keeping. Several of the accused were sentenced to death, and evidence suggests some were permitted, or perhaps required, to take their own lives rather than face public execution, a distinction that carried its own weight in Egyptian thinking about honor and the afterlife. Border security added another layer entirely. Fortresses along the southern frontier near Nubia and garrisons watching routes into the Sinai functioned as much for customs and monitoring trade as for outright military defense. Officials stationed at these points recorded who passed through, what they carried, and whether tribute or goods matched what had been declared elsewhere, folding law enforcement into the same bureaucratic habits that tracked grain harvests and temple deliveries. Beyond the courts and the guards, ancient Egypt maintained an entire framework for handling death and disaster on a national scale, and much of it began with something as unglamorous as record-keeping. Famine relief depended heavily on the granary system, where state and temple storehouses collected grain during good harvests, specifically to be redistributed during years when the Nile flood came too low or too high. Egyptian officials tracked flood levels using nilometers, stone staircases, or graduated columns built into riverbanks and temple enclosures, allowing scribes to measure the water's height with precision and estimate months in advance whether the coming harvest would be abundant or catastrophic. When the flood failed, the consequences rippled through the entire society, and Egyptians left behind unusually candid accounts of this fear. Inscriptions from Elephantine describe a 7-year famine attributed to the Nile's failure to rise. Though modern historians suspect the tale was later dramatized to flatter a particular pharaoh's piety in solving it, still, the underlying anxiety was real. Tax records from certain years show reduced grain assessments, a bureaucratic fingerprint of drought rippling through the provinces. Death itself, meanwhile, required its own enormous logistical apparatus, one largely separate from the emotional rituals of mourning. Embalmers operated in dedicated workshops known as the waybet, or purification place, usually positioned outside town limits, both for religious reasons and, quite practically, because of the smell. The mummification process itself took around 70 days, a timeline apparently fixed by religious convention, tied to the star Sirius, and involved removing internal organs, drying the body with natron salt, and wrapping it in hundreds of yards of linen, often reused from household textiles rather than purpose-made cloth. The canopic jars used to store preserved organs were carved with the heads of the 4 sons of Horus, each one assigned to guard a specific organ, and each of those gods was in turn protected by a goddess. This layered system of divine custodianship reveals how thoroughly Egyptian death practice fused the practical with the sacred. A decaying liver was never just a liver. It was Khabi-Senouf's responsibility, watched over by Circuit. Funerals themselves were public, noisy affairs, quite unlike the silent solemnity often imagined today. Professional mourning women, sometimes hired specifically for their skill at wailing and gesture, walked in procession tearing at their hair and throwing dust over their heads, a performative grief meant to honor the dead loudly enough for the gods to notice. The procession carried the coffin, along with furniture, food, and small models of servants called shaptis, toward the tomb, where a priest performed the opening of the mouth ritual, symbolically restoring the senses to the deceased so they could eat, speak, and see in the next life. Not everyone received this full treatment, of course. Mummification, at its most elaborate, was extraordinarily expensive, reserved for royalty and the wealthy, while poorer Egyptians were often buried directly in the hot desert sand, which, ironically, sometimes preserved bodies just as effectively through natural desiccation alone, beyond the mummy itself. Egyptian belief demanded an entire imagined landscape for the soul to travel through, and the details of that landscape reveal as much about daily anxieties as any tax record or court case. The Book of the Dead, despite its modern nickname, was never a single fixed text but a personalized collection of spells and instructions, copied onto papyrus and tailored to whichever afterlife hazards a family could afford to guard against. Wealthier Egyptians commissioned longer, more elaborate scrolls, sometimes illustrated with vivid vignettes, while poorer buyers made do with shorter, generic versions, filled in with blank spaces for a scribe to add the deceased's name later. In effect, salvation had a price tag, and the quality of one's eternity depended partly on what one's family could pay a workshop near the temple. Central to this journey was the weighing of the heart, a ritual moment imagined to take place before Osiris himself. The heart, believed to hold memory, conscience, and moral character rather than the brain, was placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, that same principle of truth and balance that governed law and kingship alike. A heart heavy with wrongdoing would tip the scale, and waiting nearby crouched Ammit, a composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, ready to devour any heart that failed the test. An act understood as complete annihilation rather than punishment, since without a heart there could be no continued existence at all. To avoid this fate, the deceased was expected to recite the so-called negative confessions, a long list of sins denied before 42 divine judges, ranging from murder and theft to more mundane offenses like cheating measures of grain or gossiping. Spells were also included to protect against practical afterlife dangers that mirrored earthly ones: hostile spirits, venomous snakes, and the possibility of having to perform manual labor in the fields of the afterlife. For that last concern, Egyptians came prepared with shapti figurines, small statuettes placed in the tomb and inscribed with spells compelling them to act as substitute laborers, answering the call to work on the deceased's behalf. Wealthier burials sometimes included dozens, even hundreds of these figures, one for every day of the year, plus overseers to direct them, essentially assembling an entire miniature workforce to spare the soul from toil in paradise. The desired destination itself, the field of reeds, was imagined not as an abstract heaven, but as an idealized mirror of the Nile Valley, with fertile fields, flowing water, and abundant harvests. A version of home made permanent and free of hardship. Reaching it required not only a pure heart, but also the correct magical knowledge, which is precisely why literacy and access to skilled scribes mattered so much even in death. Those who could not afford a proper copy of the spells, or a priest to perform the necessary rites, faced genuine uncertainty about their fate, making the entire funerary economy, from papyrus scribes to shapti carvers, as much a matter of spiritual insurance as craftsmanship. Beyond the judgment hall and the weighing of the heart, Egyptian belief extended into the physical architecture built to house the dead, and the tombs of the New Kingdom reveal just how seriously that architecture was taken. The Valley of the Kings, on the west bank opposite Thebes, was chosen specifically because its remote, hidden ravines made concealment easier than the exposed pyramid fields of earlier eras. By the New Kingdom, pharaohs had largely abandoned pyramid building for themselves, having learned, sometimes the hard way, that a giant stone marker was an open invitation to robbers. The tombs themselves were carved directly into limestone bedrock, sometimes descending more than 100 meters through corridors, shafts, and pillared halls before reaching the burial chamber. Some included deliberate false passages or hidden doors meant to confuse intruders, a kind of architectural misdirection built centuries before anyone thought to call it that. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with painted texts and images drawn from funerary literature, guiding the pharaoh's spirit through the dangers of the underworld with the same precision a modern traveler might expect from a detailed map. Many of these tombs were unfinished at the time of burial, since a pharaoh's death rarely arrived on schedule with the construction. Unyezd sections sometimes show sketched outlines never fully painted, offering an unintentional glimpse into the working methods of the artists of Deir el-Medina, whose labor and even labor disputes had already left their mark elsewhere in the historical record. Grave goods placed inside these tombs went far beyond shabti figures and canopic jars. Royal burials included furniture, chariots, weapons, board games, clothing, and food offerings. Everything the deceased might plausibly want in the field of reeds. Tutankhamun's tomb, though modest by royal standards and largely intact only because it had been forgotten and built over, still contained more than 5,000 individual objects, from golden thrones to trumpets to folding beds, giving a rare, nearly complete inventory of what royal comfort in the afterlife was imagined to require. Protective spells were carved not only on walls, but on amulets tucked directly into the mummy wrappings, layered at specific points on the body corresponding to organs or vulnerabilities the Egyptians believed needed extra defense. Scarab amulets placed over the heart carried inscriptions instructing the heart itself not to testify against its owner during judgment. A strikingly direct plea worked into the burial itself, as if preparing legal defense for a trial already described in earlier chapters of this same funerary tradition. Tomb builders and painters were themselves aware of the risk their own work posed. A tomb advertised its owner's wealth precisely to the kind of person most likely to rob it, and so secrecy in location was paired with elaborate curses and warnings inscribed near entrances, threats invoking crocodiles, fire, or divine punishment against anyone who disturbed the resting place. Whether such curses deterred anyone is doubtful, given how many tombs were robbed within decades of burial. But they reveal how seriously the boundary between the living and the dead was meant to be guarded. Beyond the great royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, most Egyptians faced death and burial in far humbler circumstances, and the surviving evidence of ordinary cemeteries reveals how ideas about the afterlife adapted to fit a modest income. Middle-class Egyptians who could not afford elaborate rock-cut tombs were often buried in simple shaft graves topped with a small mud-brick chapel, just large enough for family members to leave offerings of bread, beer, and flowers on visits. These local cemeteries surrounded most towns and were far more numerous than the grand monuments built for kings, forming the actual final resting place of the vast majority of the population across 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Funeral costs varied enormously, and a household saving for a burial might spend years accumulating enough linen, oils, and payment for a priest's services. Embalmers themselves operated at different price tiers, something the Greek historian Herodotus later described in some detail, noting that families could choose an expensive full treatment, a mid-range option, or the cheapest method, which involved little more than a purging of the body's interior before drying. The cheapest packages skipped elaborate organ removal altogether, relying mainly on the drying power of natron salt to prevent decay, which meant the quality of one's eternity was, quite literally, a matter of budget. Offering formulas inscribed on stelae and tomb chapel walls functioned as a kind of magical technology available to anyone who could afford even a small carved stone. The idea was that reciting the correct words, invoking Osiris, and asking for bread, beer, oxen, and fowl on behalf of the deceased would magically supply those very goods in the afterlife, regardless of whether real offerings were ever physically brought. This meant that even Egyptians with no descendants left to tend their graves generation after generation could, in theory, be sustained forever simply by anyone passing by and reading the inscription aloud. Tomb chapels, built for non-royal families, frequently included false doors, carved stone panels shaped like doorways, through which the spirit of the deceased was believed to pass back and forth between the world of the living and the realm beyond. Offerings were placed directly before these false doors, rather than inside the burial chamber itself, since the chamber holding the actual body was typically sealed and hidden well below ground, accessible only through a narrow vertical shaft. Visiting relatives interacted only with the chapel above, never entering the true burial space at all, which meant the memorial architecture ordinary families experienced was entirely separate from where their loved one's body actually lay. Ancestor cults extended this relationship well past the funeral itself, with some households keeping small carved busts of deceased relatives in home shrines, prayed to for guidance or protection, much like the household gods already discussed. Letters written to the dead survive on papyrus and pottery, addressed directly to a deceased spouse or parent, sometimes asking for help against misfortune, or even accusing the dead of causing it. These documents show that for ordinary Egyptians, death did not sever a relationship so much as change its terms, continuing a kind of correspondence between the living and those who had already crossed into the field of reeds. Beyond the tomb itself, Egyptians imagined an entire afterlife landscape that had to be navigated, and much of Egyptian religious literature exists precisely to help the dead find their way through it. The Book of the Dead was only one part of a larger family of guide texts, and in earlier periods, royal tombs were inscribed instead with the pyramid texts, and later the coffin texts, each generation refining the instructions for what the soul would encounter after death. The underworld itself was called the Duat, imagined as a shadowy, perilous realm the sun god Ra crossed every night in his solar bark, battling the serpent Apep, who represented chaos, trying to swallow the sun before dawn. Egyptians believed this nightly battle explained why the sun reliably returned each morning. Ra's victory was never guaranteed, only repeated, which is part of why so much temple ritual existed to support it. Priests performed rites specifically intended to strengthen Ra against Apep, treating cosmic order as something requiring constant, active maintenance rather than something automatically stable. The Duat was not depicted as a single uniform space, but as a series of gates, caverns, and mounds, each guarded by fearsome beings who had to be addressed by name using specific spells. Getting a guardian's name wrong, according to these texts, could mean being turned away or trapped. This is part of why wealthier Egyptians paid scribes to produce longer, more detailed copies of the Book of the Dead. More spells meant more protection, more names correctly known, and a better chance of successfully reaching the other side. Osiris, ruler of the dead, held a myth central to all of this. He was said to have been murdered by his brother Seth, dismembered and scattered, only to be magically reassembled by his wife Isis, who conceived their son Horus after Osiris's death. Osiris then became ruler not of the living world, but of the underworld, a resurrected god whose story gave ordinary Egyptians a model for their own hoped-for continuation after death. Every deceased person, regardless of status, was ritually addressed as an Osiris in funerary texts, merging their identity with the god's own resurrection. Horus, in turn, represented living kingship, locked in mythic conflict with his uncle Seth over rightful rule of Egypt, a struggle sometimes interpreted as reflecting real, older political tensions between regions of the country. Seth was not simply a villain in the way later religious traditions might frame such a figure. He was also honored in certain periods and regions as a legitimate god of storms, deserts, and foreign lands, showing how Egyptian mythology often held contradictions without needing to resolve them. Amulets connected to these myths were worn by both the living and the dead. The Eye of Horus, or Wedget, referenced the eye Horus lost and regained during his conflict with Seth, and was believed to offer healing and protection, appearing on jewelry, coffins, and even in mathematical fraction notation used by scribes. The Ankh, representing life itself, appears constantly in temple art, typically held to the nose of a pharaoh by a god, symbolizing divine breath being granted to sustain both cosmic and personal existence. Beyond the temples and tombs already explored, ancient Egypt's spiritual world extended into the natural landscape itself, populated by animals that were never simply animals. Egyptians practiced what scholars call zoolatry, the reverence of specific creatures as living vessels of divine presence. And nowhere was this more visible than at Saqqara, where the Apis bull was worshipped as a physical incarnation of the god Ptah. A single bull, chosen for precise markings, including a white triangle on its forehead, lived in luxury within a temple, was consulted for oracles, and upon its death was mummified with the same elaborate care given to a pharaoh, then buried in a massive stone sarcophagus within an underground gallery now known as the Serapeum. Ibises and baboons, sacred to the god Thoth, were bred and mummified by the millions at sites like Tuna el Gebel, not as pets, but as offerings, purchased by pilgrims hoping to carry a prayer directly to the god through the animal's preserved body. Crocodiles were honored at Kom Umbo in association with Sobek, kept in temple pools and sometimes adorned with jewelry, while cats, already noted for their practical role guarding granaries, carried a deeper religious weight tied to the goddess Bastet, to the point that killing one, even accidentally, could provoke serious public outrage. This overlap between the sacred and the everyday extended to how Egyptians understood time itself, particularly through astronomy. Egyptian priests tracked the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, its first visible appearance on the eastern horizon after a period of invisibility, and used it to anticipate the annual Nile flood with impressive consistency. This observation formed the basis of the civil calendar, a 365-day system divided into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 extra days added at the year's end. Days considered so unstable that they were associated with the births of Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys, and Horus. Temple ceilings and coffin lids often carried detailed star charts and decan lists, series of stars whose rising marked the hours of the night, functioning as a kind of celestial clock long before mechanical timekeeping existed. Some of these star tables have survived well enough that modern astronomers have used them to cross-check ancient records against known celestial movements. Egyptians also read meaning into eclipses, comets, and unusual planetary movements, though such interpretations were folded into religious omens rather than treated as a separate discipline of prediction. The line between astronomy and astrology, in this sense, barely existed. The sky was simply another surface on which the gods communicated with the living, no different in principle from a dream, a bird's flight, or the behavior of a sacred bull chosen to speak in its own quiet way for Ptah himself. Beyond the stars charted on temple ceilings, Egyptian medicine and healing practice occupied its own strange middle ground, one that modern minds often struggle to categorize neatly. Physicians in ancient Egypt were not simply priests muttering spells over the sick, nor were they purely rational clinicians in a modern sense. They were something in between, and that blend shaped how illness itself was understood. A doctor was called a swoon, a professional title distinct from the priestly healers who specialized in particular gods. Certain physicians even carried specialties resembling modern fields, with titles referencing eye ailments, digestive complaints, or dentistry, suggesting a surprising degree of medical division of labor for a civilization so ancient. The goddess Sekhmet loomed largest over Egyptian ideas of disease. She was imagined as a lion-headed force, capable of sending plague upon Egypt in moments of divine anger, and her priests were considered specialists in treating epidemic illness, since the same power believed to cause sickness was called upon to lift it. Statues of Sekhmet number in the hundreds, surviving from a single temple complex, suggesting how seriously her role as both punisher and healer was taken across generations of pharaohs seeking her favor. Ancient Egyptian dentistry, meanwhile, reveals a rather unfortunate collision between diet and biology. Bread, gritty with sand and ground stone fragments from milling, wore teeth down relentlessly over a lifetime, a slow erosion that left even wealthy Egyptians with worn enamel, abscesses, and painful infections by middle age. Archaeological examination of mummified remains shows this wear affected pharaohs just as much as laborers, since everyone ate the same coarse bread regardless of status. Some evidence suggests attempts at rudimentary dental bridgework, with teeth bound together by gold wire, though scholars still debate whether these were functional treatments performed on the living or symbolic arrangements made after death. Surgical knowledge, particularly as recorded in papyri dealing with trauma, shows a level of clinical observation that surprised early Egyptologists. Cases were described using a consistent format: examination, diagnosis, and then one of three verdicts: treatable, contestable, or untreatable. That final category is notable in itself, since it shows physicians were willing to acknowledge the limits of their craft rather than promising a cure for every patient. An unusually candid admission for a healing tradition so deeply entangled with religious belief. Magic and pharmacology often appeared side by side, within a single treatment. A wound might be bandaged with honey, known even then for antibacterial properties long before germ theory existed, while a spoken incantation accompanied the dressing to ward off infection believed to be caused by hostile spirits. Ingredients ranged from the practical, like willow bark used for pain relief, to the bizarre, including specific animal dung, applied for particular ailments, chosen for symbolic rather than chemical reasons. Contraceptive recipes appear in surviving medical texts as well, describing pastes made from crocodile dung or fermented plant substances inserted before intercourse. An early and rather blunt attempt at controlling fertility that predates any understanding of reproductive biology. Midwifery formed its own body of specialized knowledge, largely held by women, and passed through oral practice rather than formal scribal training. Birthing was considered dangerous enough that women often gave birth in specially built birth arbors away from the main house, attended by midwives, and protected symbolically by household deities associated with childbirth. Egyptian medical papyri even include tests for predicting pregnancy and fetal sex, using the growth patterns of barley and wheat seeds soaked in a woman's urine, a method modern researchers have tested and found produced correct pregnancy results at rates notably higher than pure chance. As the new kingdom moved through its long afternoon of prosperity, Egyptian society had already developed something quieter than temples or tombs, a deep habit of record-keeping, born simply from the wish to be remembered. Ordinary people left behind small traces of themselves, not because they expected fame, but because writing, even a little of it, felt like a way of pushing back against time. Graffiti scratched onto temple walls and cliffsides by travelers, workmen, and low-ranking priests survives in surprising quantity, often nothing more than a name, a title, and a wish to be remembered by the gods. These weren't official inscriptions commissioned by kings. They were personal, almost private gestures, left by people passing through sacred spaces who wanted some small part of themselves to remain there. Votive offerings served a similar purpose. Pilgrims visiting shrines to Hathor or other approachable deities left small stelae, models of ears meant to ensure the god was listening, or simple clay figurines representing a wish for health, a child, or safe travel. None of these objects were expensive. They came from people without the wealth for grand monuments. Yet they reflect the same underlying instinct as the pharaoh's temples, a hope that devotion, however modest, might be noticed. Letters, too, carried the same tone of personal continuity. Beyond the petitions to the dead already known from tomb walls, ordinary correspondence between the living survives on ostraca and papyrus fragments. Requests for grain, complaints about debts, reassurances sent to family members far from home. Read together, they sound remarkably human across 3,000 years of distance. Concerned with the same small worries that occupy people in any era, there is something gently humbling in how much of what remains from Egypt was never meant to last as monument, only to serve a private, momentary purpose, a prayer, scratched into stone, a name left behind by someone who would never see it again. These fragments were not built to impress the future. They simply happened to survive it. Perhaps that is part of what makes this civilization feel so close, even now. Not only the gold and the temples, but the quiet, ordinary wish, shared by nearly everyone who lived along the Nile, to leave some small mark of having been there at all, a wish that needed no permanence to matter, only the moment of its making. As the new kingdom aged into its later centuries, something quieter began to happen beneath the grandeur of temples and tombs. Egypt's monuments were built to last forever, and in many ways they succeeded, but the world around them kept moving. Dynasties changed, foreign powers pressed at the borders, and slowly, the golden age that modern imagination clings to gave way to something less certain. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt had already outlived most other civilizations of its time by well over 1,000 years, and its people seemed to sense that weight of accumulated history pressing on them. Later Egyptians looked back on Old Kingdom pyramids, the way people today might look at cathedrals built in the Middle Ages, structures whose builders felt impossibly distant, almost mythical. Priests of the later periods sometimes restored or copied inscriptions from 1,000 years earlier, not fully certain what all the old religious language meant, but preserving it out of reverence anyway. Power did not vanish so much as scatter. The high priests of Amun, whose wealth had grown to rival the pharaoh's own treasury, eventually governed portions of Upper Egypt almost independently, while kings ruled from the north. For a time, two centers of authority existed under one nominal crown, a quiet fracture that mirrored, in a smaller way, the very balance the concept of Ma'at was supposed to prevent from breaking. Foreign dynasties would eventually rule the Nile as well, Libyan, Nubian, and later Persian and Greek. Yet what's easy to miss is how much of daily Egyptian life continued almost unchanged beneath these shifts at the top. Farmers still measured their year by the flood. Scribes still trained on broken pottery. Offerings were still left at household shrines to Bees and Hathor. Political power moved above a foundation of ordinary routine that had simply worked for millennia, and so it endured with little need to change. Even Egyptian religion itself proved unusually absorbent. When Greek rule arrived under the Ptolemies, Egyptian gods were not erased but blended, Amon merging conceptually with Zeus. Isis eventually worshipped as far away as Rome itself, carried by soldiers and merchants who had only ever known her through Mediterranean ports. In a strange way, Egypt's gods outlived Egypt's political independence by centuries. What remains striking, all this time later, is not any single monument or artifact, but the sheer patience of the civilization that made them, a culture willing to build for an eternity it never expected to personally witness. By the time Egypt fell under Roman administration, something curious had already been happening for centuries. Its language, its gods, its rituals had begun traveling far beyond the Nile Valley, carried outward by trade, by conquest, by simple human curiosity about a civilization that already felt ancient to everyone around it. Temples to Isis appeared as far away as Roman Britain and the Danube frontier, tended by worshippers who had never seen Egypt and never would. Her cult promised personal salvation and protection in a way that resonated well beyond her original home, and for a time she became one of the most widely venerated deities in the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Egyptian obelisks were dismantled, shipped across the sea, and re-erected in Roman forums, admired as trophies of a wisdom older than Rome itself. Hieroglyphic writing, by then, was understood by fewer and fewer people, a script slowly drifting out of daily use, kept alive mostly within temple walls by a shrinking circle of priests. The final known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Philae in the late 4th century CE, a quiet, almost unnoticed ending to a writing system that had recorded Egyptian life for well over 3,000 years. For more than a millennium afterward, no living person could read what those symbols meant. The temples still stood, half buried in sand, their painted colors fading under a sun that had watched over them since before most other civilizations existed. Travelers, scholars, and later archaeologists could see the images clearly enough. Gods with animal heads, kings frozen mid-ritual. But the meaning behind them had gone silent, locked inside a language no one could speak anymore. It would take the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and years of careful comparative work to finally reopen that door in the early 19th century. Only then did the granaries, the letters to the dead, the tomb curses, and the tax records begin speaking again in something close to their own words. What perhaps stands out most, looking back across everything covered here, is not any single monument or ritual, but the sheer duration of it all. Ordinary Egyptian life, farming beside the same river, baking the same bread, praying to household gods for the same small protections, continued with remarkable steadiness through pyramids and empires alike, through golden ages and foreign rule, largely indifferent to whichever distant power claimed the throne. Civilizations rise and reorganize themselves in countless ways, but few have left behind such a complete, intimate record of what daily existence actually felt like, written not only by kings, but by scribes, farmers, mothers, and workers who simply wanted to be remembered. As Egypt's story moved beyond its own borders, something quieter remained behind, in the objects left in the sand, rather than in the temples and inscriptions already discussed. Modern excavation itself became a kind of afterword to this history, one that unfolded slowly, and often by accident. In 1799, French soldiers reinforcing a fort near the town of Rosetta uncovered a broken slab of black granodiorite while digging defensive trenches, with no idea they had found the key to a language no living person could read. It sat for years as a curiosity before its true value was understood. The stone itself was never meant to be extraordinary. It was simply a decree from priests, repeated in 3 scripts so that different readers of its own time could understand it. Its importance only emerged centuries later in hands that had nothing to do with the world that made it. Early European travelers who visited Egypt in the centuries before serious archaeology existed often treated ancient monuments less as history and more as raw material. Mummies were sometimes ground into powder and sold as medicine, believed to hold healing properties simply because they were old and strange. Wealthy visitors purchased sarcophagi and statues as souvenirs, with little record kept of where such objects had actually come from. Entire tomb chapels were dismantled and shipped abroad piece by piece, scattering context that could never fully be reassembled. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that excavation slowed into something closer to careful study, with archaeologists beginning to record find spots, layers of soil, and the position of objects relative to one another. This shift changed what could be known. A broken bowl, if left exactly where it lay and studied in place, could reveal more about ordinary life than a polished treasure removed without notes. Much of what fills museum collections today survived not because it was especially valuable to the people who made it, but because it happened to be forgotten in a dry, undisturbed corner of the desert. Even now, new fragments continue to surface: a scrap of papyrus in a private collection, a tomb shaft uncovered during construction work, a name half erased on a temple wall. Each discovery tends to confirm something already suspected from other sources, more often than it overturns it entirely. The picture of ancient Egyptian life, built patiently over more than 2 centuries, keeps filling in around its edges, rather than being redrawn from the center. What remains striking is how much of that picture rests on small, unremarkable things: a laundry list, a child's toy, a letter about unpaid grain, saved by nothing more than the dryness of the sand around them. There is something quietly humbling about how much of ancient Egypt survives simply by accident. A scrap of papyrus used to wrap a mummified ibis. A child's broken toy left beneath a house floor at Deir el-Medina. A grocery list scratched onto a shard of pottery by someone who never imagined it would outlast empires. Most of what modern historians know about daily life along the Nile was never meant to be a historical record at all. It was simply someone's ordinary Tuesday, written down and forgotten. That is part of what makes this civilization feel, even now, so strangely close. The pharaoh's court and its golden ritual can feel distant, almost mythic. But the scribe grumbling about his workload, the mother testing a wheat seed to see if she was pregnant, the artisan carving a joke into the margin of his work, those details survive precisely because they were human, in the smallest, least monumental way. 3,000 years is a long time, and yet a complaint about an unfair boss reads the same now as it did then. Modern Egyptology has also had to reckon with how much was lost simply by not being written down. Formal history remembers kings, wars, and temples because those were the things carved in stone to last forever. But the person who wove the linen, who fired the bread ovens near Karnak, who patrolled a border fort in the Sinai, their names rarely survive. Historians now spend a great deal of effort trying to reconstruct exactly those lives, piecing together the anonymous majority from tomb paintings, ration lists, and the walls of workers' villages. It is slower work than searching for treasure, and less dramatic, but it has quietly become the more valuable kind of discovery. There is also a certain irony in how the culture obsessed with permanence, with pyramids and mummification and eternal afterlives, ended up teaching so much about impermanence instead. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers came and left their own mark. Even the gods changed names as they crossed into other empires. And yet, underneath all of it, the Nile kept flooding on its yearly rhythm. And people kept baking bread, raising children, and leaving small wishes carved into stone walls, simply to be remembered by someone. Someday, perhaps. That is the quiet thread running through all of it. Not the gold, not the monuments, but the very human hope of being remembered at all. In a strange way, every person listening to this tonight is doing exactly what those ancient hands hoped for, thousands of years later. After so many small details, it is worth pausing on something larger. Ancient Egypt lasted for roughly 3,000 years, which is a span of time so long that it makes almost every other measure of history feel brief by comparison. The distance between the builders of the Great Pyramid and Cleopatra is greater than the distance between Cleopatra and today. And yet, across all that time, the ordinary rhythms uncovered in these chapters changed remarkably little. People still rose with the flooding of the Nile, still ground grain into bread, still told stories to their children, still left small offerings for gods they hoped were listening. What endures from that world is a strange mixture of the monumental and the accidental. Temples and tombs were built to last forever, and in some sense they did, but it was the broken pottery shard with a child's handwriting on it, or a worker's complaint about missing beer rations, that ended up saying the most about what daily life actually felt like. The grand and the mundane were never really separate in Egypt. A farmer's labor fed the same system that raised Karnak's columns. A midwife's quiet knowledge sat alongside the elaborate theology of the afterlife. Neither existed without the other. There is also something quietly humbling in how much has simply been lost. Entire lives, entire households, entire versions of ordinary happiness and worry, vanished without leaving a trace, not because they mattered less, but because paper and mud brick do not survive the centuries as easily as stone. What remains is a partial picture, pieced together from fragments that happen to survive by chance rather than intention. And still, from those fragments, a remarkably human world comes through, one concerned with family, work, fairness, and the hope of being remembered. Maybe that is the quiet thread running through all of it. Beneath the gold leaf and the temple ritual, ancient Egypt was made of people trying to live decent meaningful lives within the time they had, not so differently, in the end, from anyone listening to this now. The pharaohs believed the world would collapse without their rituals to hold it in balance. In a smaller, quieter way, so did everyone else. The scribes, the farmers, the mothers, the craftsmen. Each one holding up some small corner of that same ancient world. And that's where we leave it for tonight. Wherever you are, however heavy your eyes have gotten, there's nothing else you need to do right now. Just let it all go. Sleep well.